said, they've already seen the effects of consolidation. They know what that means to them and to their jobs and their ability to do their jobs, and they think it's critical. They think it's critical that these FCC regulations be turned back.
Few challenges facing our democracy are more urgent and deserving of citizen attention than those involving the ownership, management, governance, and use of the major media in this country. I'm Larry Hanson, Vice President of the Joyce Foundation. In conjunction with CAN TV, we are pleased to bring you the following coverage of the National Conference on Media Reform. Political and community leaders, journalists, educators, and media activists from around the country gathered in Madison, Wisconsin in the fall of 2003 in response to the call to transform the media into a force that supports democracy and the public interest. We hope that this coverage helps to inform your understanding of this important issue.
Good afternoon. My name is David Newby. I'm the president of the Wisconsin AFL-CIO. I'd like to welcome you to our panel discussion this afternoon. The first thing is I've been asked to announce that the 6:30 speech scheduled for Ralph Nader will be either canceled or postponed. Apparently his flight did not make it. If he can be rescheduled, that'll be announced tonight at the event at the Orpheum Theater. So Ralph Nader's speech at 6:30 has been either canceled or postponed. What I'd like to do in beginning this panel discussion is essentially to establish a context for our discussion. Item number one, over half of the American public believes that there's a direct connection between Saddam Hussein and the terrorist attack of 9/11. Item, a 2002 poll said that 70% of the American public favored eliminating the estate tax, or as the Republicans put it, the death tax. 70% of the American people favored eliminating that tax, even though only 2% of estates are subject to that tax. Item, a majority favored both the 2001 and the 2003 tax cuts proposed by President Bush, even though those who benefited most were the richest 1% of the people in this country. At the same time, that majority felt that increasing inequality of wealth in America was a bad thing. There's a disconnect going on here. Norbert Schwartz, who was a cognitive psychologist at the University of Michigan, said that these figures provide, quote, a powerful illustration of how the combination of low factual information and good political spin creates preferences that aren't in people's interest. Or in the words of Audioslave guitarist Tom Morello, when presidents and politicians lie, it is the job of the press to expose and challenge those lies. When the press fails, the lies become laws. Question, how can we get a fair analysis of issues that affect working families into the media? And how can we assure that the voices of actual working families and informed working families are heard? Is the independent and alternative media our only hope? Or can mainstream and corporate media be reformed so that they actually serve the interests of the majority? Second issue for us to think about and discuss this afternoon. As in the rest of the workforce, a declining percentage of media workers have the protection of a union contract. And even though I suspect most of us would agree that a democratic media requires democracy in the workplace, or at least a freedom of media workers to speak and write for themselves without fear of losing their job or being subject to reprisal. And so the question is, how can unions of media workers promote democratic media? Can unions such as the Newspaper Guild help move us towards media reforms that actually promote a more informed public? For our discussion this afternoon, we have two speakers. Our second speaker will be President John Sweeney, President of the AFL-CIO, who will be introduced. who will be introduced by our first speaker, who is Linda Foley, who is the president of the Newspaper Guild. Linda grew up in Pittsburgh. She went to Northwestern School of Journalism. After graduating, she worked the copy desk at the Lexington, Kentucky Herald Leader, a Knight Ridder newspaper. She then became a reporter, feature writer, and makeup editor. By age 24, she was president of Local 229 of the Newspaper Guild. In 1984, she went to work full-time for the Guild in Washington, D.C., in the collective bargaining department. She was elected Secretary-Treasurer of the Guild in 1993 and Guild President in 1995. Please welcome Linda Foley.
Thank you, David. You know, usually when I speak in front of a crowd that's big like this and gathered like this and full of supporters and progressive people, I'm used to, starting with a chant. So I guess we could start with the chant this afternoon. What do we want? Media reform. And when do we want it? Now. What do we want? Media reform. And when do we want it? Now. What do we want? Media reform. And when do we want it? Now. Okay, now I feel like I'm at home. I like to think that my organization, the Newspaper Guild, now the Newspaper Guild CWA, we merged with Communications Workers in 1997, has been in the media reform movement for 70 years, since the day that Haywood Broun, the founder of our union, put out a call in his column for newsmen, as he called them in those days, to organize a union because the publishers were getting too powerful and wanted to be exempt from many of the laws that were being passed under the National Recovery Act. So every day, my members are on the front line of this fight. It may not seem that way to the folks in the outside world. It may not seem that way to those of you who have been in the media reform movement, but we are. I would like to start off by quoting the First Amendment, and that may seem trite, but I think it sort of brings together these two ideas of why the labor movement and why my union in particular consider the media reform issue so important. The First Amendment says, and I know you all know this, but the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Well, that's never been more important than it is today, when the government and the corporations are becoming one. We have to fight corporate power if we're going to preserve our democratic government and if we're going to preserve those rights that are outlined in the First Amendment. Now, just to sort of put this in context, in the industry where we primarily represent workers, we represent media workers in broadcast, but primarily in print. We also represent them in online and elsewhere. Publishing, book publishing, and so forth. But most of our members are in print media. And just to give you an idea of what's already been happening prior to this latest round of consolidation, and now we're on the edge of having even more consolidation if these FCC rules go through, which we're fighting hard to make sure that they don't. Back in 1950, there were 1,774, the number of newspapers in this country daily newspapers was 1,774. In 2002, the number of daily newspapers in this country was 1,457. And that just shows you, that's a 21% decrease in the number of newspapers in this country, and that just shows you in our industry alone what's happened. At the same time that was happening, the number of newspapers over 250,000 circulation, okay? The first number was about all daily newspapers. The number over 250,000 circulation, the big boys, right, increased by 8.5%. At the same time the total number was decreasing, the number of large newspapers was increasing. And I think that sort of shows what's been happening in our industry. And as I said, we've been on the front lines of that. Our members are the ones whose jobs get cut first when media consolidations occur. Our members are the ones who feel it every day in their jobs. And no matter what you think, the vast majority of people, and I know there are some, I saw some of my friends here from the Guild in the audience who are Guild members, who are working journalists in the mainstream media, and no matter what you think about how well the media covers, and they don't do a very good job actually, the mainstream media covers issues that are important to people, regular people like us, no matter what you think about that, I can tell you that the vast majority of the reporters who entered journalism entered because they wanted to make a difference, because they wanted to do just that. They wanted to make a difference in the lives of ordinary people. And that's why they entered the profession. And that's why so many of them who are good are leaving the profession. Because it's very, very demoralizing for them these days to be a reporter in the mainstream media. It's very, very demoralizing. As David mentioned, the most important reason that media workers need to be organized, that media workers need unions, is because media workers, and reporters in particular, have to fight for stories. They have to have the ability to stand up to the corporate owners and say, no, we're standing up for what's right. And the first step to doing that is standing up for yourselves. So they have to have provisions in collective bargaining agreements that say that you can't be fired or disciplined except for just and sufficient cause. If we don't have media workers who have that basic right in their workplace, we're not going to have a media that has any kind of accountability at all. I'm going to give you an example of how important that is. We used to represent the workers at the Cincinnati Enquirer. We no longer do. That's a paper that's owned by Gannett Newspapers. Boo hiss. Several years ago, there was a story in the Cincinnati Enquirer. It was quite a good story. It was, could have been a Pulitzer Prize-winning story, and they published it in a special section, and it was about the abuses by Carl Lindler's company, Chiquita Brands. Carl Lindler is a big player in Cincinnati. He's the most powerful man, arguably, in Cincinnati. And the story outlined all of these abuses that had occurred, that had been perpetrated by Chiquita Brands in Latin America to corner the banana market. And the reporter, a guy named Mike Gallagher, had done this big expose with the support of the Enquirer. Well, the union was no longer at the Enquirer, and when Lindler, of course, saw the story, he got very upset. And lo and behold, a few days after the story ran, there was a huge apology, not a retraction, but an apology on the front page of the Cincinnati Enquirer, essentially saying, we're sorry we did this. The reporter subsequently was fired because they said that he stole company emails in order to do the story. Back when I was in journalism school, we were taught to do that kind of stuff, right? Go and get the stuff that you need to get to get the story. He was fired. He ended up cutting a deal. He, as a result, had to end up naming the sources that he had for the stories. An executive at Chiquita Brands who had supplied the emails was fired, and it went on and on and on. And the story became that what had happened to the reporter and not the abuses that Chiquita Brands had perpetrated on the people of Latin America. I use that as an illustration to say that if we had maintained union membership at the Cincinnati Enquirer, and if he had a collective bargaining agreement that said that he could not be fired except for just and sufficient cause, there would have had to have been a hearing. He would have at least gotten a fair hearing about his journalism practices and the practices of the Cincinnati Enquirer. And I don't know whether that would have turned out differently. Maybe an arbitrator would have ruled anyway that he deserved to be fired. But the fact is that he would have had a fair hearing, and at least there would have been an airing of these issues. And that, more than anything, when I think about the struggles that we have, that more than anything, I think makes the point. We have been very much involved in the current struggle with pushing back the FCC changes and the FCC deregulation. We've been on the front lines of that, and it's because our members have encouraged us to do that. They believe that this is a really important fight. As I said, they've already seen the effects of consolidation. They know what that means to them and to their jobs and their ability to do their jobs, and they think it's critical. They think it's critical that these FCC regulations be turned back. I do want to talk about a couple of examples, real-life examples that we have seen that may illustrate why this is important. One is actually north of the border in Canada. We also represent journalists in Canada as well as in the United States. And there is Canada, believe it or not, in Canada the media is actually more concentrated than it is here. But there is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is a public service broadcasting company that helps that situation quite a bit. But the private media is very concentrated in Canada. And there's a company called CanWest Global that is the second largest media company in Canada. And they own something like 40% of the newspapers and half of the public broadcasting outlets, or close to that. So they have an enormous amount of power. And they also, the family that owns them, has a political agenda that they want to get across. So they, several years ago, or 2 years ago actually, they came down with a decree that all editorials must conform to the corporate editorial policy that was being set in Winnipeg. Now you can imagine how well this set in Montreal, okay, in Quebec, where they're sort of independent-minded there. And so the journalists in Quebec at the Montreal Gazette revolted and withheld their bylines from their stories in protest of these editorial policies that were coming on high. They were disciplined, and eventually there was a gag order placed on them that they were not allowed to talk about this issue inside or outside the workplace. And it became a really, really poisoned atmosphere. That spread all across Canada, and now the CanWest story is a very big story in Canada because it's moved from controlling editorials to actually controlling news coverage. There have been instances where stories have been changed to conform to the wishes of the corporate bosses in Winnipeg from CanWest Global. The interesting thing about that is that the Canadian Television and Radio Commission had an opportunity to stop that, or at least put the brakes on that, when the CanWest Global merger occurred between print and broadcast, just like the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership ban that we have here that's in play. And they chose not to require separate editorial operations or separate editorial management and operations in those media properties. And as a result of that, you see the consolidation of editorial decision-making that has occurred in Canada. Another interesting footnote to that story is CanWest Global, in the FCC proceedings here, commented on what was about to take place at the FCC here and commented on the rules, saying, of course, that their experience from a corporate perspective was that it would be a good thing if the media were deregulated here in the United States. So that's an interesting sort of warning sign for us here south of the border. A couple of other examples, and this leads me to sort of my, what you can do kind of thing. I'm going to give you a good example of how media workers, people that work in the media, my members, and the community, can join together to really make a difference when it comes to diverse media voices. 3 years ago, Gannett and their partner in crime, Liberty Media, in Honolulu, announced that they were ending the joint operating agreement there between the Honolulu Advertiser and the Honolulu Star Bulletin. And that would mean that the Star Bulletin would close, that Honolulu would lose a newspaper. We, with our allies in the labor movement, stepped in, went to the State Attorney General. We got the State Attorney General to file an antitrust suit. The Justice Department eventually stepped in. And we also went out and organized citizens in the community whom we found really cared whether there were two newspapers. They really cared whether the Star Bulletin continued. And they rallied, and we formed a committee called Save Our Star Bulletin, SOS. And they rallied, and they would stand outside with us, outside the Star Bulletin, saying, "Save our Star Bulletin, save our Star Bulletin," every day, until a judge issued a temporary restraining order keeping them from closing the paper and ending the JOA. And eventually we took that suit to the Ninth Circuit Court in California, and we won. And today there are two independently owned newspapers in Honolulu, the Star Bulletin and the Honolulu Advertiser. And to me, that's what we need to do. We need to join forces with the people that work in the media who care very, very much about the kind of product that they're putting out. And folks like you in the communities who also care very, very much about the product that they're putting out. We need a convergence, to use the C word, of the workforce in the community, because the issue here is, whose media is it? And we're going to have to take this battle. I mean, we may win, we may lose the FCC battle, but we need to go city by city and take back the media for the people. And not just for you and for your communities, but also for the people who work there, because they care deeply about what that media is and what it says. I would like to introduce John Sweeney in a second. He's going to talk about more globally about the labor movement and some of the things that we can do together with the media reform community to make this happen. But before I do that, I want to introduce somebody else. Isha Williams is sitting down here in front. He is right now on sort of unpaid leave from the Brattleboro, Vermont Reformer. He was fired for trying to organize a union at the Brattleboro Reformer. He was a reporter there, is a reporter there. Hopefully he'll get reinstated. His case is pending before the National Labor Relations Board. And he was fired not because he went into the newsroom and stood up on a table with a sign that said union and made everybody, throw down their pens and pencils and turn off their computers. No, he didn't do that. He called his elected representatives to ask them to sign on a letter to support the unionization effort, and that's why Isha was terminated by the Brattleboro Reformer. These are the kind of tactics that media owners use against people that work in the media. There's a tremendous amount of fear out there about standing up for what's right. And so when my members see what's happening in this community here, when they see this reform movement, they get emboldened and they stand up and they start doing the kinds of stories that they need to do, and they start fighting for the kind of stories that they need to fight for. John Sweeney's going to get up here now, but as a way of introducing him, I want to say that I first met John Sweeney in Detroit on a picket line where we were fighting for the rights of media workers in Detroit. A lot of you probably, or some of you probably were there along with us. And that actually was the first time, I think John said it was the first time that he was arrested. I know it was the first time I was arrested. We sat down in front of the Detroit News, and because we sat down in front of the Detroit News, exercising our First Amendment rights to peaceably assemble, they arrested us, and several others. But the truth be told, we didn't actually go to jail. They took us to a gym where they kind of booked us, and then they let us go. But the fact is that John Sweeney was there for the media workers in Detroit, and he's been there for the media workers in every struggle that we've had. He understands the importance of having a democratic media. He understands why it's important not just for the workers who work in media, but for the entire American labor movement. And with that, I'd like to introduce John Sweeney.
Thank you, Linda, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, Dave, for your facilitating this program. I want to thank the National Conference on Media Reform for inviting us to play a role in this historic conference. Our unions are the unified voice of millions of workers and their families all across the country. We're vitally concerned with free public debate and news coverage, both of which are now threatened as never before by media concentration. In our instructions for this afternoon, we were told to stick to our assigned subject, which is media workers, media corporations, and media reform, and to try and focus on solutions rather than merely restating the problems we're all having. I'm not sure I have any magic bullet solutions to offer, but I thought I would begin today by sharing one that so far has worked. Everyone is aware that the media reforms recently promulgated by the Federal Communications Commission have now been bottled up by Congress, and we're all working hard to contain the evil genie personified by Mr. Powell. Like all organizations represented here, the AFL-CIO tried to do its share. We passed a strong Executive Council resolution urging the FCC to maintain, retain, and even improve the safeguards now in place. We publicized our position widely, and then we submitted our own filing with the FCC. But we decided that kid gloves are no solution in a bare-knuckles fight, and so we put our political and legislative machinery behind congressional efforts to repeal and to repel the FCC's attempt to eliminate what's left of our country's free press through free market competition. So through our website and our e-activist network, we generated more than 170,000 letters protesting media monopoly to none other than Senator John McCain, with copies to the FCC commissioners, Senator Hollings, and to our activist-owned representatives in Congress. We're ready to do the same thing again and again, and we're getting better at it every day. So I would suggest to all of you that one of the solutions we should increasingly turn to is stand up together by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions, and just say, no, hell no. When I was elected president of the AFL-CIO 7 years ago, we called our reform team a new voice for American workers. And we pledged to restore the voices of working families in our workplaces, our communities, our government, and in the global marketplace. We put together a solid media outreach operations, coupled it with new grassroots organizing, mobilization, and political action operations, and adopted a new attitude we call Streets and Suites approach to collective action. We visit the media mavens in their lairs with regularity, whether it's a publisher's luncheon at the New York Times, an editorial board visit with the Chicago Tribune, or talking head sessions with the likes of Tim Russert and Lou Dobbs. We do the suites. But we decided from the beginning that to cut through the bias created by media elites, covering only other elites, our solutions would be found in the streets. We did that in Watsonville, California, where 50,000 unionists and our community allies marched on behalf of the strawberry workers and began a movement that resulted last year in Governor Gray Davis signing a bill that for the first time guarantees the freedom of agricultural workers to get a contract when they join and form unions. We took to the streets in Seattle, also 50,000 strong, and changed the debate on trade forever, despite the biases of the elite media. When Enron and WorldCom and Arthur Andersen tried to destroy the confidence and retirement dreams of millions of working Americans, we put our feet on Wall Street and set the right direction for accounting and corporate governance reform. And just last month, we rallied 100,000 strong in New York City after our immigrant workers' freedom ride across the country, where they compelled media attention in more than 100 cities. I can't say that we've changed the debate over immigrant rights forever, but I now know we can and will win the battle to guarantee immigrant workers reconciliations with their families, a clear path to full citizenship, the same rights and benefits enjoyed by all Americans, and the freedom to join a union without being harassed, intimidated, terminated, or deported for for trying to do so. I bring these things up now, not to brag about the victories of organized labor, and God knows we've had our share of defeats. Gore versus Bush, not the least of them. I bring them up to demonstrate that there are solutions to media concentration available, and to suggest that, excuse me, while we must all continue to seek remedies through the regulatory process, we must realize that our relief lies eventually through the political process. General Electric, Westinghouse, AOL, Time Warner, Disney, Paramount, Rupert Murdoch, Michael Powell aren't going to grant us access to the media through the FCC. Their goal is to dismantle the FCC. Justice comes to us, and we get to see the Reagans on network television. Only when we break the corporate hold on our government by dismantling the Bush administration. I wish, go right ahead. I wish that the only problems we have were with the electronic media. Most of our newspapers and magazines are also firmly in the corporate clutches, and those of us in the union movement see the effects every day, as Linda has so articulately showed us. We saw an example last Tuesday in the lead editorial in USA Today, a piece entitled, "Flyers Beware Post-Merger Promises from Airlines." The editorial properly took on American Airlines for violating the commitments made when it acquired TWA, and the cities, some of the impact on business travels, fewer flights, fewer cities, fewer seats. But there is absolutely no mention of the impact on men and women who worked for TWA and were fed the promises and are now having trouble feeding their families. On November 1st, more than 1,000 former TWA employees in St. Louis were shoved out the exits without so much as a chute, and those job losses will cause the destruction of more than 50,000 other jobs in the city. But there's no mention in USA Today. Here's another example. Last week, there was a quarter-page story in the New York Times publishing a report citing the dangers posed by forcing nurses to work excessive overtime, written by Robert Pear, one of the preeminent healthcare reporters in our country. Good for the New York Times. Our nurse unions have been pounding for years on the patient problems caused by mandatory overtime. But look who's quoted in the story. The chairman of health policy at Johns Hopkins and 3 other members of the panel that produced the report. Republican Senator Charles Grassley, who says if we mandate minimum staffing in nursing homes, the nursing homes will just ask for more money. Then there's the vice president of the American Healthcare Association, which represents nursing homes, saying the nurse shortage means sometimes there's just no alternative to overtime. And there's an officer of the American Organization of Nurse Executives saying it's an accepted practice for nurses to work 12-hour shifts. But in this 750-word story, there is not one word from a working nurse or a nurse union leader saying, thank God for this report. We have to stop the practice of working 12 and 16 hours a day because excessive overtime and mandatory overtime are killing our patients. And that's just one shameful example of media elites talking only to healthcare elites. Of course, the bitter irony about the New York Times article is that on the same day, the same report got 150-word back-of-the-hand treatment in the Washington Post, which started out, and I quote, "Tired and grumpy nurses dispense the wrong drugs, waste hours on paperwork, and forget to wash their hands. a panel of experts concluded in a report that called for shorter hours and better working conditions. Now, that's not just shameful, it's disgraceful. Fortunately, for patients in hospitals and residents in nursing homes, we're doing a lot better out in the States when it comes to more fair news coverage and legislative action. Just last week, unionized nurses at Allegheny General in Pittsburgh, where Linda was born, won a new contract banning mandatory overtime. Just a few months ago, the California legislature, with media support, passed a sweeping bill maintaining minimum nurse staffing levels, and it was signed into law by, of course, Governor Gray Davis. I don't want to steal any more time about ranting about the problems of working families and our unions when it comes to media concentration. But I do want to say a few words about the new bad boy on the block, Clear Channel. We all know that what Clear Channel has built around their cash cow, Rush Limbaugh, when it comes to radio. In just 6 years, they've rocketed to the level of Viacom, Disney, and NBC, and now own 1,239 radio stations, reaching 100 million listeners daily. But what is not well known is that Clear Channel is now the #1 concert promoter and largest owner of live entertainment venues and the largest outdoor advertising company in the world. The company, for instance, owns and operates more than 44 amphitheaters, 51 theaters, and various clubs and arenas around the country. And it has become a major player in Broadway theater. It owns 25% of the producers and is a dominant force in the Broadway touring business. In the United States, Clear Channel has 35,000 employees, most of whom do not belong to labor unions, and it is threatening union standards in multiple segments of the media industry. Equally important, it is threatening entertainment standards. The so-called Broadway touring shows they send out are non-union and pay young actors 1/3 the Broadway minimum. Just like all of you, and just like all of the members who marched in Watsonville and on Wall Street, the actors being victimized by media concentration are devising their own solution. 2 weeks ago, we took the issue of non-union touring shows to the streets in New York, in Times Square, and one of our main speakers was Sandy Duncan, whom we all remember as that nice little Sandy Duncan. Her words, and I'll close today by quoting part of what she had to say. Quite frankly, if the current wave of money guys grows tired of us and dealing with our so-called unreasonable demands, and they discover they can't make the exorbitant profits they claim they don't make, they can go sell clothes or pet rocks or something. If I never work in this town, that's just fine. Do visit me in the home. We'll talk about the good old days you can put in motion from this day forward. Close quote. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to working together with you.
Thank you, John. I've asked Linda Foley to give just a few remarks in response to John Sweeney's remarks while we're getting the questions up here, and then we'll go to the question and answer discussion period. Linda.
Well, actually, that's not on. I agree with everything John said. Those are my comments on what John said. But actually, what I wanted to do, what I asked David if I could do, is mention to you a very important day that's coming up. December 10th is Human Rights Day. Some of you may know this, and I'm proud about Human Rights Day because Eleanor Roosevelt was very much involved in that in her work in the UN in human rights, and Eleanor Roosevelt was a member, an active member of my union. She wrote a column called My Day, and was an active member of the Newspaper Guild as a result of that. December 10th, in honor of Human Rights Day, all around the country, the AFL-CIO and working people everywhere are going to join together to fight for our First Amendment rights to peaceably assemble. Labor laws in this country, as you heard from my example of what has happened to Isha Williams, are practically non-existent. And the right of people to organize is really being threatened. And on December 10th, all around the country, there are going to be events highlighting this fact and calling for labor law reform. But I'd like to challenge this group to, number one, participate in those activities, but more importantly, to do what you do best, which is agitate in the media to cover this and to cover this issue and make sure that, that these abuses and this movement to reform labor law gets covered. Thank you.
Okay, here's a somewhat, well, it's a procedural question. The FCC has authority to control use of the airwaves. What do you suggest as a means to block consolidation in print and non-broadcast media? Do we need more aggressive antitrust enforcement?
Does this one work? That one doesn't. Yeah, I think, well, the answer to that is yes, we do need more active antitrust enforcement. The difficulty you have with print is this, that, you know, I quoted the First Amendment, and we have a tradition in this country that I actually agree with, and I think that everyone in this room agrees with, which is that we don't, you know, we don't want the government regulating the press per se. And it's a tricky issue to figure out where is that line drawn. Now, the media owners and the media corporations and media barons always hide behind that for anything that they have to do to be good citizens. So, like for example, wage and hour laws, they used to argue, don't apply to us because we're covered by the First Amendment and government can't regulate us. Well, of course, you know none of us in this room would draw the line there. So regulating print media is not something that we do in this country, and I would not advocate that we do it. Where it intersects, however, is two areas. One is antitrust, and yes, there are things that can be done vis-a-vis antitrust. I gave an example in Honolulu, how we use the antitrust laws to ensure that 2 newspapers remained in Honolulu, and there are, I believe, 12 joint operating agreements still left in this country that are an exemption from antitrust that allow newspapers under certain conditions to operate joint commercial departments but keep separate editorial departments and separate editorial voices. So there are a number of places where now that's not good enough for the media owners. They want to wipe it out altogether and go to one monopoly, one voice, one editorial, as well as commercial monopoly in these cities. So we have this underway right now in Seattle, for example. There's a battle going on about whether they're going to continue the JOA in Seattle. This is a fight that we can join, not only in Seattle, but everywhere it comes up. So that's a very specific antitrust action that can be taken. And the Department of Justice, as a result of what happened in Honolulu and San Francisco, I might add, which was on the heels of the Honolulu decision, even under the Bush administration, is taking a hard look at these arrangements. So that's something that we can do. And the other thing is that as these media companies become more consolidated, antitrust concerns really do come into play. The only thing I would say to be careful of is that's Michael Powell's argument. Michael Powell's argument is we don't need these media regulations in the electronic media because we have antitrust laws. So we have to be careful in the media reform movement that we don't fall into that trap, arguing that too vociferously. Arguing that instead of arguing that there should be regulation of the public airways. And then finally, on the print side, there is one rule that is in play with the FCC that covers print, and that's whether or not a corporation or a media owner can own a broadcast outlet and a newspaper, a print outlet, in the same market. That has been banned for decades, since the 1970s, and they want to get rid of that ban and allow newspapers to own broadcast outlets in the same cities and vice versa. And by the way, I believe those are the first mergers that will occur if the FCC rules go through, because they're all lined up. Those deals are already being made in the back rooms, and they're all lined up and ready to go with that. So that's kind of the scope when it comes to print.
Thank you, Linda. John, there's a number of questions, and I'll read all of them very quickly, but they all hit at the same issue. Why can't the labor movement launch our own USA Today, a pro-labor daily with wide circulation? When will organized labor abandon its dependence on corporate media outlets and begin to fund, produce, and distribute its own media through alternative channels? There are Somebody start passing the hat here. There are hundreds of cable channels available on every cable system. Why doesn't labor have a labor network? And finally, if the coverage of labor in the elite media is so bad, why doesn't labor start its own mass media or help bankroll experimental ventures? Good luck, John.
How much time do I have? All of those
You've got more time than money, John. That's the problem.
Am I?
Yeah, there you go.
All of those questions are very good questions, very important ones, and are a part of our constant review in terms of how do we play a stronger role in terms of getting our message out. It's as important for improving the perception of the labor movement among our own members as well as improving the perception of the labor movement outside to the public at large. And we are working in a number right here in Wisconsin. There's a lot of work going on in terms of media outreach and the programs that have been expanded here, which are model programs for other state federations in so many ways. The bottom line is that the labor movement has a limited amount of resources. A number of our affiliates have already expanded their activities. The UAW has now owns a group of radio stations spread around different regions of the country that they're deciding on how they operate them. There are groups being formed that focus on progressive radio and TV on cable, and many of our unions are trying to expand their own activities, but each of these questions is a major part of our consideration in terms of how do we do a better job as a labor movement in building our own media operation and getting our message out. And it's crucial to us, but the resources are the biggest concern right now, and how we manage those resources. And I don't think you'll see much expansion of union resources into media until after the 2004 elections. Every ounce of resource that we have is going to go into the political campaign next year, and we can't match the money that the other side has, but we can certainly build the people power that we have and engage our rank and file members in every congressional district all across the country.
Going to say, as someone who has been involved in more than one strike newspaper, during a strike we try to put out our own paper, just in a single community, the logistics of that, even just finding a press, let alone finding distribution for a newspaper that's put out, just as an example, it's an enormous undertaking. And it's very difficult for organized labor with the resources that we have to have that kind of reach that these big media companies have. I mean, that horse is kind of already out of the barn in some respects. I mean, they already have a corner on the market. It's very difficult. That's not to say that we can't start, And I think we are doing some things like John mentioned here in Wisconsin, there's the Workers' Independent News Service, and there are some beginnings of that. And the internet also affords us the opportunity to reach out to our members more. And I think we're doing that. But remember, the labor movement is about getting people on the streets, as John said. And we really need to partner with media experts and people who are media people to make that happen, in my opinion.
Thank you, Linda. Here's a question for both of you in a way, and has to do with essentially coalition building through unions and other media groups. Despite your best efforts, the vast majority of media workers don't belong to unions. This is especially true in smaller markets. How can concerned citizens support non-union media workers? How can media democracy movement bring media workers in? From a member of the National Writers Union, how can unionized media workers in the U.S. do a better job of working together and working with our labor allies around the world? And finally, one way organized workers can weigh in on media reform would be for union members to help media activists monitor coverage of working families' issues in the 2004 elections. Is there a possibility the AFL-CIO might work with us to make this happen? And who might we write to at the AFL-CIO to share ideas like this one?
Well, John said to me that he'll take the world, I'll take the other part of it. The first part of that question was about building coalitions with non-unionized or workers that are not yet unionized, I should say, in the media. That's something that we're really trying to do, both specifically in my union, the Newspaper Guild, the CWA. We're trying to figure out new ways to connect with workers who are out there without necessarily having to go through a union election and get them recognized. For example, we have a number of groups in CWA, including a group in Washington State called WashTech, that is essentially freelance workers in the high-tech industry, many of whom are in high-tech media, who have formed their own group, but they don't have collective bargaining rights. They're essentially freelancers. The question came from the National Writers Union. That's another example of, I think, an innovative way to connect with freelancers who don't have collective bargaining rights. We need to broaden that to workers in more work-for-hire situations who can connect up with us on issues of interest to all of us. And then, of course, from our point of view, we eventually want to bring collective bargaining rights to those workers. Because we believe that that's the only way that you can really have true democracy in the workplace, and you can really affect what happens to the product that you produce. And we're trying to do that by reaching out on issues of professionalism. There is a real crisis in journalism. In fact, I just came from a meeting at the Aspen Institute where all these journalism groups were talking about how can we, what can we do about the crisis in journalism that's occurring? So the journalists out there are all feeling this, and the question is, how can we all join together and work on things that make this that improve this situation and push back against the corporate bosses? The difficulty is what I cited before, which is the fear factor. And I mean, these are ruthless employers, as ruthless as J.P. Stevens or any of the other corporate bullies that you could think of, Frank Lorenzo or anybody else. I mean, the practices in newsrooms today, and this is part of the problem, part of the reason that we don't get coverage of workers' issues is that, one, there's a corporate culture, and two, there is a real fear and a real push to make sure that there is never unionization in those newsrooms. And that's really an appalling development. It wasn't always that way. We do need to reach out to people that don't have collective bargaining rights, who do work in this industry, particularly, as they said, in small markets. And again, we're trying to do that through issues like media reform, where we feel that we have a common goal and that it's not so threatening to them in terms of, unionization, and perhaps they'll join in with us. And also, you know, through the internet and through the publications that we put out, and also just, you know, really trying to create a buzz within the journalism community that says, hey, you know, we need to all join together on these issues. John, you want to take on the world part of it?
Just a couple of points. Regarding who you should write to, you can write to any one of the three of us, and we'll make sure that one of us, that we all get the message. But we welcome any ideas or any suggestions that you have, not just in terms of the question at hand, but in terms of anything that the labor movement should be doing or isn't doing or could be doing better. You know, when you talk about organizing in this particular industry, it's really, in the broad sense, no different than talking to any group focused on any industry regarding organizing. A few of us stopped in Jefferson, just 30 miles from here today, to visit with the Tyson food strikers. And here's an example of I have never seen a group of more courageous workers than the workers that I met today. So often, you know, in every strike there's a tremendous amount of courage and tremendous amount of commitment. But the solidarity of this group of UFCW strikers and the support of the community in Jefferson was just exemplary. And this has been going on since February, the end of February, I guess it's been. But what I'm getting to is the employer there is no different from some of the employers that Linda's been talking about, the most anti-union, anti-worker, anti-healthcare, anti-just about everything, interested in one thing, the bottom line, corporate greed, CEO compensation, stock options. That's what life is all about for those people. And we're seeing more and more of this all across the country. When Linda highlighted the fact that we're doing this International Human Rights Day, which is focused on workers and their voice at work and their right to organize and join unions if they want, this is indicative of what we're seeing across the country in terms of harassment, intimidation. They're scaring workers to death. Our polls show that 50% of unorganized workers would join a union if they had the opportunity and if their employers didn't harass and intimidate them. There's statistics backing all of this up, and our goal is to get labor law reform, and we're going to be talking more about that over the course of the next several months. But it is so important that we reach out to folks like yourselves for whatever suggestions you have, whatever contributions you can make to. We need the allies, we need the support, we need the wisdom that is right here in this room. There was a point raised about the international scene and how we reach out internationally. Morty Barr, the national president of Linda's Union, CWA, is chair of our International Affairs Committee. Everything is becoming global. We see corporations global. Our governments are reaching out for global partners and global allies. We in the labor movement have to do a stronger job in terms of global solidarity around the issues of globalization. Corporations from other countries are controlling industries in our own country, and we have U.S. companies moving work and workers to other countries where they can get the cheapest possible deal. Our strength is in organizing workers in the developing countries as well as the developed countries, and working together with them to improve the standards of workers and working families, not to impose upon them our standards, but to impose on their countries their right to organize, their right to oppose child labor and forced labor, and their right to freedom of assembly. And that's the kind of campaigns that we are waging internationally. We need our allies in education and in the religious community and civil rights organizations, women's organizations. young people to support these activities and work together with us.
This reminded me of an issue that I also wanted to throw out there for you folks to put on your radar, because I know you're all very active on media issues, and that's the killing of journalists in Iraq. There were 7 journalists that were lost to so-called friendly fire in Iraq by American forces, and I don't believe for 1 minute that those soldiers, targeted those journalists and said, aha, there's a journalist, I'm gonna go get them. I don't believe that for 1 minute, but there is a real cavalier attitude on the part of the Pentagon about those deaths. And in the case of the Palestine Hotel, which many of you may be familiar with, there was a tank that fired on the Palestine Hotel, and 2 journalists were killed. One a Reuters, a cameraman from Reuters, and another a prominent journalist from Spain. And then more recently, after the hostilities ended, mission accomplished, or at least that's what that banner that the sailors put up there said. There was a journalist, another journalist from Reuters, Mazen Dana, who was of Palestinian origin, who was filming, had permission to film outside a prison, and he was shot dead. They said he was mistaken for, they thought he had a grenade launcher instead of a camera. And again, I mean, I don't believe that the soldiers, that the boots on the ground actually, meant to do that, and I'm sure they felt really bad about it. But here's the bad part, is the Pentagon, after investigating those 2 incidents, said that, the rules of engagement were followed. And now they won't release the investigations. The investigations are classified. The information about the investigations are classified, as are the rules of engagement, by the way. And so there's no way of judging whether mistakes were made, and more importantly, there's no way of figuring out how to keep that from happening in the future. Now, you talk about internationally, and journalists and the media internationally, they view something like that, it's just, it's beyond the pale. There are, I'm part of what I do too is I'm the vice president of the International Federation of Journalists. There are calls from journalist organizations around the world for war crimes against the United States because of those actions. And I mean, it's, one thing that we can do in this country to, is agitate, and we've been trying to do it among media circles, including the unions, but we all need to do it and say, tell us what really happened there. We need to make sure that journalists can do their jobs overseas as well as here. And, here we're threatened by a lot of forces, but if you're killed, if you're dead, you sure as heck can't report on what's happening. So we need to make sure that, that we also agitate on issues like that, because those are very important issues for journalists, whether they're organized or not organized, whether they're in the United States or whether they're in other countries. We have to make sure that journalists have the ability to cover something like the Iraq War without the fear of being shot by so-called friendly forces.
Here's a couple of questions that pick up to a certain degree on a question we had earlier. But how do we reclaim our airwaves, especially for free airtime during campaigns for public offices? And a related question, what can workers do to keep ourselves from being replaced by centralized content, such as wire services and Clear Channel's national feed? And then from the workers' perspective, many media workers are required to be independent contractors, both for mainstream commercial and alternative media. What do you suggest for such workers as they try to make a living in the media?
Yeah, that's a really long, I forget the first part of that. What was the first part of that?
How do we reclaim the airwaves?
Airwaves for campaigns, I don't know. Good question. The campaign financing and the way campaigns are conducted in this country, both on and off the air, in terms of the money, is just, it's nuts. There is a group that actually has the support of Senator John McCain, who has been very upfront on this whole issue of campaign finance reform. It's called the Alliance for Better Campaigns, and they have a proposal which probably wouldn't pass this Congress, but they're putting it in, that actually would address that issue and would allow candidates to buy vouchers. It's very complicated, but would allow candidates to buy vouchers based on campaign contributions of under $250 and get essentially free airtime based on the number of vouchers that they have. It's very complicated, but there are groups, many of the same groups that are here, public interest groups that are here working on the FCC issue are also working on that issue. So that's one possible track that can take. The other issues in terms of workers and their circumstances and freelancers and where they find themselves, that's tied in, I think, to the December 10th action that we're talking about and the issue of labor law reform. I mean, basically what's happened is because employers can get away with a huge unorganized workforce, in freelancers and independent contractors, it makes it very difficult. It's like a self-perpetuating cycle. And I think the only way that those workers are going to be able to really better their lot is to organize. And whether they're recognized, under our labor laws as having a certified collective bargaining agreement or not, if they can come together and work for their common good, they'll be better off. I'll use the example of a group that we have in CWA and the Newspaper Guild called WashTech. I cited them before in Washington State. They represent principally high-tech workers who work they call themselves permatemps. They work on a contingent basis. I know people that are in those circumstances hate that word, but they work on a contingent basis and work on and off for various different high-tech companies. They've actually formed a union of Washington State high-tech workers, calling themselves WashTech, and they've had a number of victories. Some legislative, like, for example, passing a law that companies can't keep secret personnel files on them, and that companies have to reveal, they're employed through temporary agencies, so there's a right-to-know law now in Washington State about temporary agencies as a result of the agitation from WashTech and their allies in the labor movement. And they also won a huge pension suit over pension credits at Microsoft that you may have heard about, where people actually were allowed to participate it was actually a 401k plan, I think, a defined contribution plan anyway, and were given retroactive pension benefits as a result of a suit that they filed in Washington State. So there are examples of groups that have come together and have worked. I think, the Ticini versus the New York Times suit that the National Writers Union brought is an example of, people coming together and collectively taking action. Some of those actions are more successful than others. The results are better than others. But the fact is that people are coming together, and you're always stronger together than you are apart. So I think we just have to keep organizing. What was it Al Gore said? Early to bed, early to rise, work like hell and organize. That's why I voted for him.
Joe Uline has reminded me that AFTER and the AFL-CIO beat Clear Channel in New York City over a fight for local radio content, and Clear Channel wanted to pre-record all programs from Tennessee, and AFTER was able to beat them back on the issue. Can I just acknowledge introduce Sherwood Brown, the congressman from the great state of Ohio, is with us. And if you have any tough legislative questions, he'll be glad to answer them.
Linda and John, thank you very much. There is tremendous knowledge and energy and commitment in this room today. And I would like to simply end our discussion and conversation this afternoon by encouraging all of you, as well as all of us up here, to work towards building the kinds of coalitions across organization and across group that can be effective in taking control of our media and making it work for people. And I think we can do that, and this conference is a wonderful step in that direction. And the fact that it has brought together activists from so many orientations and so many groups from all over the country is extremely encouraging, I think, towards forming the kind of political alliance that can make a difference. Thank you very much.